Thing. Welcome, everyone. This is our fourth class, I think. I can't remember the numbers of classes anymore. Anyway, we're getting down fifth class. This is the final, second to final one in this topic, The Door to Satisfaction, Lama Zopa's book with that title. So let's go ahead and start as we usually do with just a little bit of meditation. Give ourselves, we start with prayers. I'm out of practice here. All right, Mary, so if we could put the prayers, or Anna, whoever's doing that, great. Let's recite the prayers as usual, beginning with these verses of homage to the Buddha as well as to all the holy beings, and then recalling some of the fundamental teachings of the Buddha in these initial verses. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. Homage to the Supreme Buddha, homage to the Dharma refuge, homage to the great Sangha, to all three ever devout homage. To all worthy of respect, bowing with bodies as many as all realms atoms in all aspects, with supreme faith, I pay homage. Do not commit any non-virtuous actions. Perform only perfect virtuous actions. Subdue your mind thoroughly. This is the teaching of the Buddha. A star, a visual aberration, a flame of a lamp, an illusion, a drop of dew or a bubble, a dream, a flash of lightning, a cloud. See conditioned things as such. Through these merits may sentient beings attain the rank of all-seeing, subdue the foe of faults, and be delivered from samsara's ocean, perturbed by the waves of aging, sickness, and death. And we'll do the short mandala offering, again making this vast, pure offering to receive these teachings and to receive the blessings of the holy beings. We can visualize offering it to them, the Buddhas, all of our gurus, with our heartfelt requests that they continue to guide us, to influence us in our lives so we can make the most out of this human life that we have. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Hidam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. Then finally, refuge and bodhicitta before the teaching, bringing to mind these two thoughts, cultivating a strong sense of safe direction in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, especially the Dharma, which is our main object of refuge at this point. And then also cultivating the mind of bodhicitta that we'll meditate on as well shortly, thinking that you're here to engage in these teachings so you can be of the greatest benefit to all beings. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chunyen gipe sonam gi Dola Penchir Sangye Drupar Shok Sangye Chodang Soki Choknam La Jangchu Bardu Dakni Kyabsu Chi Daki Chunyen Gipe Sanam Gi Dola Penchir Sangye Drupar Shok. Okay, thank you, Mary. Let's go ahead and do our short meditation now then. So give ourselves an opportunity to focus our minds a bit. So we'll spend the first few minutes using the breath as a meditation object, and there are many ways to work with the breath. If you have one you prefer, you can do that. If you need a suggestion, generally I suggest working with the area around the nostrils. When you're breathing in and out through the nose, there's a subtle sensation in that area, sometimes on the upper lip or right in this area here, but tune into that sensation wherever it's occurring and make that your meditation object. Or again, if you're working with the breath in whatever other way, then just do the best to maintain your awareness of the breath. But whenever the mind wanders and we see that we've gotten caught up in thoughts, other things, distractions, maybe the mind's even a little sleepy, who knows? When that happens and we notice that, then we bring the mind back to the breath. No judgment, just simply correcting our meditation. So I will ring the bell to begin the meditation period, and then we'll do a short reflection and set our motivation in a few minutes. So now let's set our motivation for today's class. And in this course, we've been talking, especially in the last class, about desire, this mind of attachment that is clinging tightly to objects of pleasure, imagining that they have greater pleasure than they currently possess, desiring to continue to have those in our lives, to not be separated from those pleasurable objects. And hopefully each of us have begun to see very clearly how desire is playing a role in our lives. And maybe we can't address it completely yet, but we can begin to see some of the faults, some of the shortcomings. We've been following this mind of desire since beginningless time. And recall that when the Buddha first set out the Four Noble Truths, he said the cause of our situation, experiencing what he called dukkha, this unsatisfactory state, is desire. That is the most direct cause of our pain, our difficulty, our dissatisfaction. If we really want to know true satisfaction, we have to begin to counteract our desire, our attachment. Therefore, let's briefly review the faults that we went through in last week's class as a way of setting our motivation for engaging in further exploration of how we work with our minds in this course. Beginning with the fault that desire really only leads to more dissatisfaction and blocks our peace and happiness in the moment. We often don't see the disturbing nature of desire because it's all about pleasurable objects. It's all about getting those good things in our lives, those happy feelings. But it leads to more and more craving. We can have all the objects of desire that exist in the world and will never be satisfied. We'll only crave more. Secondly, we see how desire can lead to other afflictive states and then other problems that arise from that, especially actions we engage in on the basis of those states of mind. For example, recall how when the mind of desire doesn't get what it wants, it becomes the mind of anger. We get frustrated when our desires are not met and we have to experience something that is unpleasant. And then we lash out at others, we do things that are harmful, and even just having the mind of anger, of course, creates all kinds of problems, unrest, more dissatisfaction. Then we have other afflictions, jealousy, pride, and so on that arise on the basis of desire as well. Desire is the starting point for so much more in terms of our deluded mental states. So here too we see another major fault of desire. And then finally, we also looked at the fact that desire will actually block you from progressing on the path of Dharma. We've spoken earlier about the 8 worldly concerns. If we continue to be involved in those as our primary objective in life, to crave all of the good things and to not be experiencing the bad things, we will end up wasting this life. We won't create the causes for good rebirths in the future. We won't create the causes for our own liberation from the delusions and all suffering. And moreover, we will be blocked in terms of our ability to help others. Every one of us has a good heart and wants to be a benefit to others. But if we keep following the mind of desire, will we ever attain any sort of goal in terms of being able to truly benefit sentient beings? Therefore, on the basis of these shortcomings, these faults of desire, we should have a strong motivation to be rid of desire once and for all, to be able to use our lives as meaningfully as possible with the motivation of bodhicitta, with the desire to achieve the greatest possible goal of our own enlightenment, so we can then help others to overcome their desire, to achieve their potential. So make the determination to have that motivation of bodhicitta throughout today's class, so that everything we do will help on your own spiritual path to full awakening, being able to be free from desire and all the delusions, all the distorted states of mind, all the obscurations, and to enhance all the positive qualities, compassion, love, patience, kindness, and so on. So you can be of the greatest benefit to each and every single sentient being. So once again, good morning. And again, in this course, we've been looking at a number of topics. Let me review really briefly with some slides, because I don't know, in the initial beginning part of the class, I thought I might not be using so many slides, but then I realized, I mean, so much of this is using Rinpoche's words from the book, and I'm not wanting this course to be a book report by any means, but nonetheless, we're trying to use what Rinpoche taught even, all those years ago. I think it was in the 70s when he taught on this text in Bodh Gaya. But there's so much rich stuff in here, and the more time I spend with the book, the more I realize what a precious gem it is. So I hope you get a chance to read the book. We started off with knowing how to practice Dharma, recognizing this perfect human rebirth we possess and practicing the Lam Rim. We went over the stages of the path, the Lam Rim in the first 2 sessions. Kind of, this is the real purpose of our life. This is how we find true satisfaction, is taking the Buddhist teachings to heart and being able to implement them in our lives. But then we went on to look at the things that keep us from being able to do that. First, the idea we have to give up this life. Recall that little quote from Lama Tisha, who was saying that to one of his disciples. We are so attached to this life. We are so caught up in this life. This is the beginning of our Dharma practice, is to not be so preoccupied with all the things in our lives that tend to make us so, we get so busy with them, we get so involved in them, and we end up wasting our time. Again, the activities themselves aren't the problem often. It's the actual mind of clinging and grasping and craving that's involved. And that's where we went on to the 8 worldly dharmas, which again, I won't recap other than just saying these are the ways that clinging to this life manifests. We get quite attached and involved in all the affairs of this life. And this is one of the biggest problems in terms of our even beginning our Dharma practice. Recall that Rinpoche said that when he discovered this text that he's commenting on in Door to Satisfaction, he realized he hadn't even been practicing Dharma up to that point, which of course we all have to take to heart to some degree. Are we all practicing Dharma, or are we still quite involved with the 8 worldly dharmas? Is even our own Dharma practice caught up in mundane concerns? So then last week we looked at cutting off desire. And again, I covered the points of that in the meditation today. We have to begin to see the faults of desire. Because at this point, recall that again, desire is one of the main, the root delusions. We have those 3 delusions that are said to be the 3 poisons. The ways that it manifests, in terms of desire, that is one of the most tangible ways, as I said in the meditation, that we're involved in patterns of suffering, because we're always coming from that default mode of craving, clinging, wanting, desiring. We talked a little bit about that last week in Venerable Pemo's question about what are we really talking about here? What is the flavor of that? Recall that again, there's a pleasant feeling that arises that is the fruition of past karma that we did that was virtuous, that was good, that resulted in a pleasant experience. But we then overlay on top of it even more pleasure. We think it's more beautiful, delightful, delicious, whatever than it really is. And this becomes problematic because then once we built it up to that, well, then we have a certain expectation about it, and then we want to have it and we don't want to be separated from it. But then, of course, it gives rise to the opposite feeling, which is what happens when we don't get our objects of desire. As I said in the meditation, this is the biggest problem. One of the biggest problems with desire is it leads to other states of mind. As soon as the mind of desire doesn't get what it wants, or that thing that we put up on the pedestal as being so pleasurable, it fails to meet that criteria that we've set for it, well then, we have disappointment, we have anger, we have aversion, we have irritation, annoyance, all the things over on that side. Those are the second of the root poisons, the minds of, again, that can build all the way up to rage and a malicious intent towards others, what have you. So we have a pleasant feeling over here that induces this desire, an unpleasant feeling that induces all of the anger kind of emotions. The root of all of those is ignorance. And by here, we mean the deepest form of ignorance, which is this false clinging to a sense of I. We'll talk about that next week. That'll be the main way to kind of end this course, is talk a little bit about bodhicitta and emptiness. I'll talk about bodhicitta some today already. But essentially, we have to undo that ignorance to achieve true freedom. But we have to initially begin to work with some of these. The deeper work with these obviously happens further on the path. But if we keep getting caught up in these patterns, like a yo-yo, these are what the 8 worldly concerns are all about, right? We get quite attached to having all the delicious, delightful things we like and enjoy, and we get strongly averse to experiencing any diminishment of those, any change in those. And so this is how we live our lives, as Lama Yeshe says, like a yo-yo, our minds going up and down all the time. So the point of all of this, initially when we talk about cutting off desire, is to at least stop being so preoccupied with all of these things. You're still going to have pleasant experiences. You're still going to have unpleasant experiences. It's what you're doing with your mind. This is what we looked at last week as well, is that there's no fault in terms of the pleasant experience itself. It's our relationship with that. What are we doing from our side that distort that? And this is what the mind of desire is doing. It's developing a sort of addictive pattern in regard to all those pleasant objects that we have, and of course wanting to avoid any diminishment or loss of those. So recall again that we talked about in the meditation, the fact that it leads to ultimately to just dissatisfaction in the moment. We are like junkies, as Venerable Robina says, in a world full of junk, and we just keep wanting more and more and more and this and that and what have you. And there's no satisfying it. We've been dealing with this mind and desire since beginningless time, and we haven't found satisfaction yet. And it's only going to block peace and happiness in the moment. It is a disturbing emotion. This is another name for the delusions. They disturb our minds. They afflict our minds. We call them afflictions there too. The second one was, again, what I just mentioned, that they give rise to other, desire gives rise to other emotions. Because of that strong desire, we have jealousy, we have pride, we have, conflict with others. We have so many other things in our world because of desire. This is, again, the most direct way that we are creating problems for ourselves and others. And then thirdly, it keeps you from practicing the Dharma. It doesn't allow you to really fully engage in Dharma. This is what Rinpoche was alluding to when he said he found this text in this cave in Nepal, was that he suddenly realized that a lot of what he had done, even though he felt he was engaging in spiritual practice, doing all these mantra recitations, doing all these sadhanas, doing all these offerings, all these practices, and yet, are they really Dharma? Dharma, again, is that which is directed towards at least one's future existence, if not beyond that, to liberation and enlightenment. That is what really defines Dharma, is that which holds you back from future suffering, be it in the next life or beyond. And then what we have as non-Dharma, of course, is everything that's preoccupied with this life. This is the definition of Dharma and non-Dharma that Rinpoche presented last week in the teachings that I shared with you. So this is where we're at now, is we're kind of, okay, we've developed some conviction to move away from desire. How do we learn to work more with our minds so that we can have better skills and better things to use as counterforces to some of this? Sometimes being aware of the faults of something is enough, and it is enough to initially get you to move away from it. I mean, we find this very true in regard to even just things concerning this life. If you go to the doctor and the doctor says, oh, your cholesterol is really high and it looks like you might have heart problems if you keep eating the way you're eating and not exercising or whatever, then you take that advice. Why? Because you don't want to have future suffering. You see the faults that are arising on the basis of the diet that you currently have, and you change your diet accordingly. This is, something that we all know, and many of us have already done in relation to whatever health problems some of us have experienced. Those who've had diabetes, for example, know that you have to change your diet and you have to do different things, or else the diabetes will become very problematic. So people do that on the basis of seeing the immediate effects that they can have. I think the problem with some of these things we talk about in Dharma is that we might not see the immediate effects as much as we see that there will be long-term effects from this. We will be able to experience greater peace and happiness beyond this life if we let go of all of our clinging to this life. So again, this is what we're going to go into a little bit more today. Rinpoche has a really interesting chapter that's all about, it's called Transforming Non-Virtue into Virtue. But I'm labeling it today in terms of this exploration. I'm going to call it the importance of motivation, which of course gets into how are we working with our minds in terms of the intentions that we are setting at the beginning of each day as well as throughout our day. So this is the first topic I want to talk about today. And I'm mostly using, I think it was chapter 4, Transforming Non-Virtue into Virtue, as the basis for what we're going to discuss and what I'll be presenting. Then we're going to look at the next chapter, Subduing the Mind, which of course is still on that thread of how do we work to diminish the negative tendencies in our minds to increase those that are positive. How do we actually do that work? And then one of the topics that I've alluded to previously, which is also so important in our Dharma practice, at least turning towards Dharma and being devoted to our Dharma practice day in and day out, is to recall death and impermanence, the fleeting nature of this life. So this is my plan for today. We'll see if I'm able to get through all of this, but my hope is I can conclude this today and we can move on, as I said, to talking a bit more about how we cherish others, develop bodhicitta, which is part of what we're going to discuss today in terms of motivation, but then also bring in the emptiness teachings a little bit so that we understand the final antidote to all of the crazy states of mind that we have, all the afflictions, delusions. So this is from the text by Lodro Gyaltsen, again, the text that Rinpoche found in this cave. This is his translation of this. Before Dharma activities, the function of the mind, which means the motivation here, is the most important. If one talks or works with a negative mind, one receives, I should say, receives suffering from that action, as in the example of the head cut off by the wheel. If one talks or works with a calm mind, one will receive happiness from that action, as in the example of the moving shadow. So you might wonder what these examples are. And Rinpoche has actually taught on these verses at the Light of the Path before. These are actually the very first two verses of what's known as the Dhammapada in the Pali tradition. There is a version of the Dhammapada in Tibetan that has a slightly different order of the verses and includes some other things, but I'm using a version of the Dhammapada from translated by Gil Fronsdal. And this is the very first verse of the very first chapter that's called Dichotomies, where they kind of, the alternate verses set out two different things that are opposed to each other. So they begin the same, both of these verses. All experience is preceded by mind, led by mind, made by mind. Speak or act with a corrupted mind, and suffering follows as the wagon wheel follows the hoof of the ox. So if you have an ox that is hooked up to a wagon, then the wheels of the wagon follow the ox. Wherever the ox goes, that's where the wheels go. So that's the example that the Buddha used in this to talk about how if we have a corrupted mind, a negative mind, then suffering will follow us, just like the wagon wheels follow the hoofs of the ox. Then going on to the second verse, all experience once more is preceded by mind, led by mind, made by mind, which of course we've heard so many times in this course. We should know this, but this is to remind us that it's all about our minds. And here, speak or act with a peaceful mind, a kind mind, a loving mind, and so on. And happiness follows, like a never departing shadow. Just like when you're out in the sunlight, your shadow never leaves you. It's always kind of following along with you. Well, your happiness will follow in the same way. So that's my understanding of where these came from. Nonetheless, Rinpoche did relate a story behind these that he heard from one of his teachers. So I'm going to go ahead and share that. I'm not going to put it on the screen because it was just really a bit too long. He says the examples mentioned relate to the following story as told by His Holiness Song Rinpoche. Two beggars went separately to beg food from a monastery. One went in the evening when the monks were fasting, so he didn't get any food. Bad timing. He showed up when, of course, the monks only eat midday meal and then they don't eat the rest of the day in the monasteries. So, he didn't get any food. But the other beggar went at the right time when the monks were having their midday meal, their lunch. So he received plenty. The beggar who didn't receive any food got very angry. Out of anger, he said, "I wish I could cut off the heads of all the monks and watch them drop on the ground." Very soon after he had said this, he was lying down by the side of a road when a chariot came past and one of its wheels cut off his head. Pretty grotesque. Anyway, that's the monk who, of course, was having the negative state of mind towards, or the beggar who was having the negative state of mind towards the monks, who was creating that type of karma. Now, again, usually karma doesn't ripen that immediately. Nonetheless, an ordained community is a pretty strong object, and you could have potentially things ripen a bit more quickly. But again, it's to demonstrate. I don't know if this is a true story. It's basically to demonstrate, the power of our thoughts. That if we have those negative thoughts, especially towards something like the Sangha or the Buddha or the Dharma itself, then of course we have created a very negative energy that we're going to experience the effects of. The other beggar, who got plenty of food, was very happy. Feeling grateful to the monks, he said, "I wish I could offer the monks nectar of the gods." This wish generated enormous merit in his mind. Afterwards, he went to lie in a park under a tree, where he stayed for the rest of the day. Throughout the whole time, the shade of the tree did not move away from him, so he was able to enjoy the shade of the tree in what I imagine was a hot day in India. And so he was able to enjoy that due to his having that very virtuous thought towards the monks who had given him food. At that time, the local people were searching for someone with special qualities to be their new king. Seeing the beggar who was always covered by the shade of the tree, they asked him to be their leader. So again, whether this story is true or not, the whole idea is to exemplify that whatever we do with our minds, the action or the results follow immediately. Everything that we talk about in terms of karma, we often speak of karma as if it is involved in more of our speaking and our physical behavior, and it is. But where does that start? It starts with our minds. Our bodies don't go to do something, steal something from somebody, or try to kill an insect or whatever the case is, without our minds being involved. Our bodies are essentially inanimate matter that is animated by the mind. And so it's the same with our voice, right? We don't all of a sudden start talking without our minds being involved. Everything follows the thoughts of the mind, and of course what we create with our minds and then is manifested with our speech and our physical actions creates the karma, the cause for our future results. And without a doubt, those things follow. Just like the wagon wheels follow the hoof of the ox, and the shadow follows the person in the sun. So again, the Rinpoche story is a little, different take on that, but it's the very same idea that everything is following from our thoughts. So what's interesting is he then goes on to tell this little story that many of you have heard before, but I want to share. It's very short, Rinpoche's way of telling this story, which is the one about the Bodhisattva captain, because this whole section about importance of motivation and the idea of transforming non-virtue into virtue really spells out how we can make this life incredibly meaningful if we bring the right motivation to what we're doing. So again, it doesn't mean that we have to necessarily change a whole lot of things. You're still going to have, once more, pleasant objects in your life, unpleasant experiences. But what are you doing with your mind? What is your motivation? What is your intention with whatever you are meeting? So here, this story, again, as I said, you've probably heard it before, but it's nice to hear how Rinpoche relates it. He says, there are also other stories. Generally, killing is negative karma. However, in one of his past lives, Guru Shakyamuni Buddha killed a human being. He was the captain of a ship that was carrying 500 traders, and one person on board was planning to kill all the others. Realizing this and thinking that the person would go to hell and experience suffering for many eons if he succeeded in his plan, the captain felt unbearable compassion for him. He thought, I will go to hell in his place. I will kill him before he has the chance to kill the others. Even if the karma of killing him means that I have to go to hell, I'll still do it. So out of unbearable compassion, the captain killed the traitor. So you might look at this and you might think, well, how does that work? That he's actually taking the life of this being and he is creating what would seem to be negative karma by killing, but he's got this compassionate motivation. He is not thinking, it doesn't even mention in Rinpoche's description that he's thinking about the other people on board the ship that are going to be killed. That isn't his motivation, is, oh, I better kill him before he kills all these people because I don't want all them to die. He's thinking about the man who's going to do that killing, that man who's going to accumulate unbelievable negative karma and the suffering that will ensue for him further down the road because of that action. Of course, when I hear this story, I often think, well, why didn't he just tie him up or, do something with him that could, keep him from doing that act of killing? But it's to demonstrate, though, again, I don't think it's to give us, complete license to do whatever we want as long as we feel like we've got a good intention, but to demonstrate the power of the mind. To demonstrate that when we have really pure motivation, even negative actions can become positive. So this is the idea behind this whole chapter, again, calling the transformation of non-virtue into virtue. So this is what Rinpoche says on that. However, because of the motivation of great compassion that this captain of the ship had as this bodhisattva captain, this action of killing did not become negative karma. Instead, it became a special means of accumulating merit and shortened his stay in samsara by 100,000 eons. It said that bodhisattvas have to accumulate 3 great countless eons of merit. Well, this shortened his stay in terms of his ability to get enlightened even more quickly, rather than have to stay in samsara to accumulate all that merit. He accumulated 100,000 eons worth of merit by doing that one act of killing. And you once more go, well, how does that work? How can it be that powerful that it overcomes any of the negativity that's generated when you take the life of another human being, which is the worst form of killing. It's not to give, again, excuses for killing other beings, especially small beings, insects, and what have you. Every being, we should protect its life and do what we can to avoid killing or harming them. But especially with human beings that have much greater potential to use their life in a meaningful way, it's a very serious act to kill a human. So this is what the text by Lodro Gyaltsen says, because the story was related there as well. For most people, killing is negative karma. However, because the action of the captain who killed a human being was motivated by great compassion, it did not become negative karma. On top of that, it became a special method of completing the merit and so forth. Just what Rinpoche was commenting on, essentially. So Rinpoche then says, the text says very clearly here, that this action did not become negative karma. Though sometimes this is disputed, and you will hear some accounts where they say, oh, this being the Bodhisattva captain still had to take rebirth in the hell realm, but then he was only down there very shortly, and he came right back out because there was some negative karma around that action. But Rinpoche holds the opposite. He says some people find it very difficult to accept that this action of killing done out of compassion is actually virtuous. It became a virtuous action because of the mind state of that bodhisattva captain. Those who oppose that view argue that the motivation is virtuous, but the action itself is non-virtuous. So the bodhisattva captain would have to experience some negative result because of that. Some geshes may argue like this in the context of the Hinayana teachings, but it says very clearly here in this Paramitayana text. The Paramita, of course, is perfection vehicle. It's the sutra teachings that are about the Mahayana, the goal of attaining enlightenment through the Buddhist teachings in the more common discourses, rather than the Vajrayana teachings or Tantrayana teachings. But in the Paramitayana text, it says that the captain's action was not negative karma, period. There was no negative karma accumulated, not one iota of negative karma. In the Hinayana teachings, it is fixed that the 3 actions of body, killing, stealing, and sexual misconduct, which again generally means to engage in adultery, to have sex outside of one's committed relationship, or to forcibly cause someone to engage in sexual behavior, rape, other forms of sexual abuse, and so on. That would be those actions of body that are taught in the Hinayana as being negative, as well as we carry them over into the Mahayana. And then the 4 actions of speech, lying, slandering, gossiping, speaking harshly, that all of these are negative, without a doubt. There is no permission given, he says, to perform these actions because Hinayana teachings emphasize the action more than the attitude. However, in the Paramitayana teachings, Buddha permitted these actions when a bodhisattva sees that the action will definitely bring benefit to sentient beings. The action does not become an obstacle to the achievement of enlightenment. Instead, it actually helps the bodhisattva achieve enlightenment more quickly. I think this is, again, very hard for us to get our heads around because we have this idea that is thrown around in our culture that the end justifies the means kind of thing. And a lot of people have a hard time signing up for that, right? Because it seems like you're saying that no matter what the goal, what the way that you get there, if the goal is good, if the idea is good, well, then we have to support it in a sense. But I think here what we're talking about is maybe, again, something different than our worldly way of examining that. Because first of all, do we all have perfect wisdom if we are holding that type of idea? That we know that the goal is going to be good. We know that the ends justify the means and what have you. And we might even go about the means with a distorted state of mind. Here, the idea is that if we have a very clear state of mind to begin with, that sets us in that path of engaging in a particular action, that then we influence that action in a very different way. And then the ends, of course, the results we get from that are in line with the motivation that we create, not in line with the action that we engage in. Why I'm bringing this up is because I'm not going to be encouraging you all to go out and kill others with compassion. That's not the point. The point is not that we kind of feel like we've got liberty to engage in whatever negative behavior we want as long as our motivation is clear. We can get to a point where we can transform non-virtue into virtue. The idea right now, though, is how can we even transform what we call our neutral activities into virtue? How can we actually make what we do day in and day out into a platform for creating incredible virtue, incredible positive potential? That's where I'm going with this, just so you know. I'm not, trying to give a kind of, again, free license for you to go out and do whatever negative actions you want and think, oh, I'm killing this mosquito with bodhicitta. It's very easy to say that. Do you really have the state of mind that creates that type of a positive action in the way that this bodhisattva captain did? Remember, he was a bodhisattva. He wasn't, just an ordinary being with a bit of a compassionate thought. So, Hinayana, Rinpoche says, is the foundation of Paramitayana, but Hinayana teachings do not mention bodhicitta, which is revealed in the Paramitayana. In the Paramitayana, the mind of bodhicitta can make non-virtuous actions virtue. This is what I highlighted here because this is the point of all of this, is if we have the very powerful mind of bodhicitta, which is intent upon helping each and every sentient being, even for the bodhisattva captain, that person, that merchant that was on board that wanted to kill everybody that he ended up killing, he wants to benefit that being to the greatest degree. Well, then that non-virtuous action, in quotes, of killing became virtuous. It's not non-virtuous in any inherent way. I think these teachings do really fit into the emptiness teachings, which we'll get into a little bit next week. There's nothing inherently there in terms of non-virtue. It's just non-virtue generally creates suffering. Why? Because of the mind that we bring to those non-virtuous actions. Remember, when we talk about non-virtuous actions in the Lam Rim, we talk about how does a non-virtuous action become complete. Of course, it's the same with regard to a virtuous action, but let's talk about non-virtue. The first thing is there has to be a basis for that. Let's talk about the Bodhisattva captain's action of killing this merchant. Okay, so there was a basis. The basis was the merchant. He wanted to take the life of the merchant. The second one, in terms of the mental state, involves three components. First, you have to correctly distinguish or discriminate that as the person that you want to kill, and I assume he did. He killed the right merchant. He didn't kill a different merchant. He knew through his clairvoyance or through whatever ability that this merchant was the one that was going to take all the lives, and he determined that was the one he was going to then take the life of. The second element of the state of mind has to do with the motivation to kill. And we could say that at this point he did have a motivation to kill, but that wasn't all of his motivation. His motivation was to kill out of great compassion. And the third element that's there for a non-virtuous action in terms of what really drives this to become non-virtuous is one of the afflictive states. Generally, people kill out of anger. They often kill out of attachment, jealousy, pride, ignorance. There are many different deluded states of mind that trigger someone to want to kill a being. But that has to be there. And in the mind of this bodhisattva, the mental state wasn't complete. So the object was there. The mental state, yes, he correctly discriminated that being, even had a motivation to kill him, but he didn't have any delusion present. In fact, he had the opposite state of mind present. He had the mind of great compassion, the mind of bodhicitta, the mind of wanting to benefit that being, keep that being from having to experience unbelievable suffering through his taking the lives of everyone else on board the ship. Then, of course, there's the third element of all of this. After the state of mind, you have to do the action, begin the action. And in this case, I don't know, they never describe how he killed this merchant. Let's say he strangled him or something. So he took his life by, putting the rope around his neck and pulling it so that he could strangle him. And then the conclusion to it all, that's the fourth component, which is the merchant dies. And in any other case where you have the state of mind present completely, where you have an affliction present that is driving one to do that action of killing, you'd create unbelievable non-virtue. Killing a human being in particular is a very heavy karma. But that wasn't present here. So it transformed everything out of that one little bit of the state of mind component, just transforming that from an afflicted state to a virtuous state, it changed the whole act. Again, and as I was saying when we kind of pulled away from the slides, was this really does speak to the emptiness of that action. It doesn't have anything inherent within it that makes it what it is. It is what we imbue with our minds, how we are kind of creating particular things. Now, that doesn't mean, again, that we can just generate little bits of positive thoughts and suddenly everything totally transform. We have to generate great force of positive thoughts. There's no doubt that this Bodhisattva captain had that he was really practicing bodhicitta, doing everything he could to be a benefit to others. And he saw very clearly that this was the answer to how to deal with that dilemma. And he knew that there would be great benefit from doing that. So again, I think we have to be careful when we hear these teachings. I'm mostly going to, again, try to dial it down to, let's not talk about non-virtue necessarily. Let's talk about at least just our everyday activities. But we do have non-virtue whenever we're partaking of things with a mind of great attachment. So that's why, again, I will be emphasizing as we go through this, the need for us to be very clear in our motivation at various levels. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. But once more on this slide, the mind of bodhicitta can make non-virtuous actions virtuous. So it goes without saying that it can make neutral actions virtuous. It goes without saying, that that will also happen. So in developing the mind, Rinpoche says, you first transform the indifferent mind into virtue, or what I call the neutral mind, into virtue. Then, by generating bodhicitta and gradually developing it, after some time, you are advanced enough to be able to transform even non-virtue into virtue. Bodhicitta enables us to do this. So again, I think that this is very kind of Rinpoche to point this out to us and to give us this opportunity to recognize the value of that mind of bodhicitta, which is the most virtuous mind that you can ever cultivate. Again, I'm not trying to make it into a competition between us and other spiritual traditions. I don't know all spiritual traditions, but I've never come across this mind in my dealings with other people from other faiths. The idea of bodhicitta is outrageous. It's like looking at all sentient beings and thinking, I'm going to be their savior, essentially. Now, again, we don't mean savior in the way that it's taught in terms of Jesus Christ being the savior of the world and what have you. We mean that you are going to be dedicated to helping every one of those beings to achieve their greatest potential, doing whatever it takes to do that. So it has the largest base that you can imagine, all beings, not just human beings, not just the beings of this world, but all beings in whatever realms of existence that they exist. Moreover, it's wanting to take them all to their greatest happiness. It's not just, oh, I want to bring them all to good rebirth in the human state or in the God state or whatever. No, I want to bring them all to complete enlightenment. I want to bring them all to the fulfillment of their deepest wish for happiness, peace, contentment, freedom from suffering. I want to bring every one of them to that. So it's a huge mind. It's unbelievable in terms of, what we are signing up for when we say, we're cultivating bodhicitta, we want to be on the Mahayana path, what have you. But that's what makes it so incredibly powerful, is the fact that it is so vast, that it is so huge in its intention. So this is the mind that we have to, let me actually talk at this point about what we call the causal motivation and the temporal motivation, because we're going to mostly talk about here temporal motivation, but it's really important that we understand the effects of causal motivation. Causal motivation is the motivation you set before you engage in a particular action, or even particularly set it at the beginning of your day. Previously, I taught on Rinpoche's text, about the method to transform a suffering life into happiness, and how it's so important that when we get up at the beginning of the day to turn our minds towards the Dharma and towards having this motivation of using this life most meaningfully to generate bodhicitta, so that it influences everything we do throughout that day. If we have really strong force of intention at the beginning of our day, that acts as a causal motivation. If we have that thought, even, may all my actions today, whatever I'm doing, whether I'm shoveling food into my mouth, or whether I'm out for a walk, or whether I'm, yelling at somebody, bring something to mind that, at that point, that wants to cover all of that, like your blanket motivation that will make sure that everything you do that day is motivated by bodhicitta. That's your causal motivation. And you can do that again before a particular action, like say before you get in your car and you're getting ready to go somewhere to the store. You might even set your intention there. May all my actions throughout this little journey out to the, the store and what have you, may they all be of greatest benefit to others. Then your temporal motivation, which is what's going on in your mind at the moment, gets kind of overridden by your bodhicitta motivation that you had in the causal component. The causal motivation in the end is much stronger than the temporal motivation. Now, it doesn't mean you should neglect your temporal motivation. Temporal motivation is what is happening at that time. So say you get in the car, you've got this great motivation of bodhicitta for your journey out, and as soon as you pull out of your driveway and get up onto the main road, there's all sorts of traffic and people are cutting you off and doing all sorts of things, and you're getting angry and upset and honking at them. Well, again, not good to do, but there will be some residual effect of you having a bodhicitta motivation that will keep it from becoming stronger non-virtue. But nonetheless, we do have to watch our minds in the moment. We do have to try to be attentive to our minds. Otherwise, I don't think that it's, a sure thing to just say, oh, I'm going to generate bodhicitta at the beginning of the day and then I don't have to worry. I can just skate by. That's not what the Dharma teaches at all. The Dharma teaches, yes, set a good intention, but then protect your mind, pay attention to your mind is what we're going to do in the rest of today. Subdue your mind, work with your mind throughout the day, because that's so important as well. But it nonetheless, set that causal motivation. Set that motivation. That's very important. That's why when we sit down to do our practice, for example, we always, or to have a teaching like this, we always generate bodhicitta motivation at the beginning, so that we make sure that we have that thought. Because I'm sure as we go through the class, most of us aren't thinking about bodhicitta and refreshing that motivation. But if you set it at the beginning, it does have some ability to carry through. Again, doesn't completely ameliorate all of the negative things we might do, but nonetheless, it makes those actions that we engage in with that causal motivation into very powerful things. The temporal motivation, again, needs to be tended to. It is something that we do actually have to pay some heed to, because otherwise we're going to simply go astray throughout our day and cause a lot of harm and damage to others and create a lot of unfavorable karma. Let's see what else Rinpoche says. We'll do a bit more of this, hopefully finish off this section before we have our little break. So again, we start with the neutral and then we go on, and eventually at some point we can transform even non-virtue into virtue. Our text says, this is again from Lodro Gyaltsen, the text that Rinpoche found, if you give food and drink in order to tease someone or to cause a problem, unhappiness comes instead of happiness. Again, that's like the wheel of the cart, following the ox. That's the problematic behavior that we engage in. If we do something really mean to others, tease them with food and drink, or whatever the case might be, then we'll get unhappiness instead of happiness, even though we're giving them food and drink. Even though we're engaging in an act would appear to be generosity, if we have a negative state of mind. I mean, sometimes this happens where like maybe you give something to somebody, but you have an ulterior motive, right? It's all about, it's a very selfish motive. I'm going to give them a little something so that they give me something. Maybe you found out that they just inherited a lot of money and you want to be on the receiving end of some of that money, and you think, oh, I'm their friend, but oh, maybe I should give them something to make sure that I'm on that list, to receive money. So again, when we do things with a negative intention, a negative motivation, even though they look virtuous, we're going to flavor them into non-virtue. This is what our minds do. The power of our minds is important, to acknowledge. And then again, motivation comes from the mind. So that's why we have to be careful. So Rinpoche, in commenting on that, says, in other words, you give food and drink to someone with the motivation to harm them, to cause trouble. Here, even though the action may look very nice, the results will actually be negative: unhappiness in this life and suffering in future lives. Why? Because the motivation is negative. It all starts with our minds. This is the opposite of the bodhisattva captain, whose action of killing did not become negative karma, but instead became a means to accumulate merit. Because it's the opposite, because here you're doing something that looks to be virtuous and would generally be virtuous if you have the right mind state. But because you have a mind of harming or, manipulating or whatever it might be, it doesn't become virtuous. It actually becomes negative. Then another example is given by our text. If one gives with devotion, respect, compassion, and so forth, there is great joy from one's own side and from the side of others. Great joy also results from that karma later on. Okay, so you get positive results out of actions that are done with positive states of mind, with devotion, respect, compassion, bodhicitta especially. If we do all of our actions with bodhicitta, we can transform, again, especially the neutral ones to begin with, but even eventually the non-virtuous ones into, meritorious actions. Here it's just emphasizing we should do whatever giving we do, which is already by nature a positive action. But if we do it with a virtuous mind, then we are guaranteed that we're going to get, great joy from that. We will have amazing benefits. So in commenting on that, Rinpoche says, in other words, everything has to do with your own attitude, your way of thinking, your motivation. Lama Tsongkhapa says in one of his Lamrim teachings, it should say, sorry, I've got a few errors in my a few typos here, that apart from some exceptional actions, unless an action is motivated by one of the three principal aspects of the path, it becomes a cause of samsara, a cause of suffering. So let's take a look at those three principal aspects. But again, the idea is that there are some exceptional actions. We're going to come to that in a moment. There are some actions that we engage in based on the object that we are having that action in relation to. There's great power to that, and thereby they become more virtuous. But if we don't have one of these three principal aspects of the path as a motivation, it generally will result in uh, just another cause of samsara, just another cause of our future and maybe even current suffering. So the three principal aspects of the path are renunciation, bodhicitta, right view of emptiness. So we've already been talking about bodhicitta, and I think we're all quite familiar with it. The right view of emptiness, as I said, I'll get into next week in terms of making sure that we have some understanding of emptiness that we bring to bear in our actions as well. But when we say renunciation, I think here we have to also talk with once more when we talk about renunciation, we can see it in kind of two stages. This is what we've been talking about initially in this course, was we need to begin to renounce this life. That's the first step in renunciation, to at least turn our minds towards what comes after this life. If I spend this whole life only engaging in non-virtue and suffer in my next life because of it, well, then that's definitely a flaw, definitely a fault. Whereas if I spend my life at least dedicated to creating the causes for future existences, and I renounce the pleasures of this life to some degree, my attachment to the pleasures of this life, let's put it that way. Because again, this doesn't mean that you have to give up all of those things necessarily, but give up the attachment to them, give up the preoccupation to them, the 8 worldly concerns in relation to them. If we give up all of that and give up this life and actually dedicate ourselves to the future life, that's the first level of renunciation. And that's, of course, the small scope of the Lam Rim, where we learn to let go of our preoccupation with this life and be concerned about what comes after this life. The second level of the stages of the path, the middle scope, is where we generate the deeper sense of renunciation, which is the idea that we have to turn away from all of samsara because we see that even though these things aren't a problem from their own side in terms of the pleasure itself or the pain itself, it still is demonstrating that we're in an unsatisfactory existence. We are driven by our own karma and delusions to continue to have these experiences of going from life to life, never finding any real satisfaction or peace. So the second level of renunciation is the deeper one because it involves actually taking a hard look at what we are engaged in, what we are actually experiencing. And by virtue of that, recognizing that this isn't, a playground, this isn't a park, this isn't a, Disneyland. This is actually a state of great suffering. We're in a prison and we have to be free from it. So when we talk about renunciation and what Rinpoche said in that slide, let me put it back up here where he said, unless an action is motivated by, the one of the three principal aspects, it becomes a cause of samsara, a cause of suffering. So again, definitely all of our actions until we have the deeper sense of renunciation are only going to become a cause of samsara, because we're never going to even have the motivation to be free of samsara, which is again that deeper sense of renunciation. But in terms of a cause of suffering, well, again, it depends on how you how you define suffering. All of samsara, all of existence is suffering in some way, but in terms of the grosser forms of suffering, we can still have a lot of engagement in virtue if we at least develop the initial sense of renunciation. I'm just pointing that out because it might be confusing those of you who are wondering, well, some parts it says, suffering that you can be free from at various levels. You can be free from some level of suffering by turning away from, again, attachment to this life and dedicating yourself to gaining a good rebirth by practicing the law of cause and effect. It will cause you to not have the experience of pain, difficulty, to the extent that we currently have, or that we would have if we only engaged in non-virtue. But we have to generate the deeper sense of renunciation. Renunciation, as it's taught in the three principal aspects of the path, encompasses both levels, but it's primarily the second level, the level where we turn away from samsara in its entirety. And then everything we do becomes a cause for the movement away from samsara, out of samsara. Bodhicitta is simply taking the mind of renunciation and strengthening it so that we include a renouncing of the suffering of all beings. We don't want all beings to suffer. We don't want any being to be bereft of happiness and experience dissatisfaction. And so we dedicate ourselves to that greater goal. And then, of course, again, the right view of emptiness is the means for accomplishing the goals of either one of those minds. The final goal of renunciation is to attain liberation. Well, you need to have the correct view of emptiness for that. To accomplish the goal of bodhicitta, which is enlightenment, you also need to have the correct view of emptiness. So this right view of emptiness is a crucial part of both of those. The first two are more motivations that are geared at one's results that one wants to experience. The correct view of emptiness is something that we bring to bear as the means for accomplishing that. So when Rinpoche says having these as your motivation, it's good to start with renunciation. And as we saw in this text, to start initially with renouncing our attachment to this life, then to renounce all of samsara, and then to go on to develop bodhicitta, which is intent upon attaining enlightenment for the sake of all, and then to combine that with the correct view of emptiness. But essentially, again, this is what defines the Buddhist path, the path to liberation and enlightenment. So back to what he was alluding to earlier, the exceptional actions that do not depend on motivation are those done in relation to holy objects such as Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. Making offerings to these holy objects, even with the motivation of worldly concern, results in happiness. So if that beggar at the beginning who, had not gotten the offerings from the monks and actually decided he would offer something to the monks, he would have created unbelievable karma, even if he offered with a negative state of mind. That's because, again, these objects are holy. They're not inherently holy in terms of nothing has inherent existence, but they are holy conventionally. They are based on the qualities that they possess, which are generated in their continuum. These things have a greater status in our world because they are imbued with greater power and greater qualities through conventional means, through the karma that's involved. Then we'll have a break shortly, but let me just finish off this little section. Therefore, everything is dependent on the mind. Happiness, suffering, negative karma, positive karma, everything has to do with different minds. So let me stop here, and when we come back, we'll have a little bit more on this, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about bodhicitta mindfulness. How do we bring that to bear? Because even though it's not directly mentioned in this book, Rinpoche teaches on this so frequently, and I try to bring it up where I can so that people know about this practice and know how to transform many neutral activities in their lives into virtue, because this is otherwise a kind of waste of this life. So much of our life we go by without even thinking about making it into something virtuous. So let's reconvene in about 10 minutes. So at 11:15 or so, right around there, I'll ring the bell. Have a good break, stretch, get refreshment, whatever you need to do, and I'll see you shortly. Okay, I notice, excuse me, welcome back. I noticed that there's a question in the chat box about our practicing compassion, specifically in regard to how much merit might there be to our practice of compassion without realizing emptiness, and the emptiness of the person to whom you have compassion, and all the other things we talk about in terms of the emptiness of the you yourself, the action, what have you, what we often call the three spheres of emptiness. Certainly once we have some deeper understanding of emptiness, our actions become much more powerful. It's always impossible to quantify any of the kind of merit involved in our actions, even right now. And most of us, I'm guessing, because I'm speaking for myself, don't have what we call uncontrived bodhicitta. Bodhicitta is a mind that we can develop on the basis of these thoughts that I wasn't going to go into as part of this course, but just be reminded that in every Lamrim text, there's complete instructions about how to develop this mind. It's not a mind that we automatically have, that we have innately, just a desire to be of benefit to others to that extent. All of us have some compassion, seeds of loving kindness, what have you, but they have to be cultivated into bodhicitta. And then when you develop bodhicitta to the degree where it's called spontaneous or uncontrived bodhicitta, that's where it arises without that whole thought process. Remember, the one technique has to do with seeing all sentient beings as having been your mother or father, someone very dear to you. You recollect their kindness. You want to repay their kindness. You generate love and compassion for them. You generate a superior intention to be a benefit to them. And then you go on to cultivate the mind of bodhicitta. And there is a second technique that involves Tonglen and all these other practices. But the idea is that if you have to rely upon those techniques to generate that mind, then you don't have uncontrived bodhicitta. And in fact, to have uncontrived bodhicitta, it's my understanding, based on the studies we did in Italy at the master's program, that you would need a much deeper state of meditation to support that as well. So most of us don't have the deeper meditation, nor do we have the familiarity with bodhicitta to have it even at that degree, without even talking about the wisdom realizing emptiness or having some deeper understanding of emptiness. So when we talk about our actions, whether we just have the small level compassion, whether we have, an uncontrived or a contrived bodhicitta, an uncontrived bodhicitta, a bodhicitta that is together with the understanding of emptiness, what have you, our actions are going to become much more powerful as we develop our minds. But I would not want to discount the things we can do in our lives right now simply on the basis of some genuine compassion. So we have to start where we are and cultivate what minds we have, and then try to unite the wisdom mind of emptiness together with our compassion as best as we can. But recognize that this is all a process. It's not something that we have to wait until some further time to then practice on the basis of these minds that we're developing. We just have to keep doing what we can, driven by those. We're not going to always have the other component to a to a Buddha. Talk about compassion, wisdom. The third component that's often referred to is sort of the power, which infers the skillful means, the ability to use that compassionate motivation and that wisdom to bring to bear the greatest benefit for all sentient beings. Well, most of us aren't going to have that sort of skillful means to know exactly what needs to be done. Instead, we're going to make mistakes. We're going to have a compassionate mind that wants to help that mosquito, but in the process of maybe catching it and putting it outside, we end up killing it, And so we go, oh, I had compassion for it. I wanted to find a new home for it or whatever. It got stuck inside the house. That happens with flies, moths, whoever, these beings that come into our house, and we know if they're in our house for too long, they're going to die because they don't have all the things that sustain their lives. So anyway, you might have that very strong compassionate motivation to benefit that being, but you end up harming them in the process. Well, again, we don't have perfect abilities. So what I'm pointing out by David's question in terms of this different, will our compassion be that powerful or have that much merit if we don't have the wisdom of emptiness? Well, yes, but that shouldn't stop us from using compassionate motivation and from generating stronger and stronger bodhicitta motivation throughout all of these activities. So I hope that answered the question, but if not, maybe you can let me know in the chat box and I'll make sure to address that. So let's get back into the slides. I just have a little bit to finish off this topic of motivation, and then the rest of the topics for today I don't think will take quite as much time. Rinpoche says, This is in another book that is Rinpoche's teachings from the Light of the Path back in 2016 or 2009, I believe. Mindfulness practice can be related to all the different parts of the Lam Rim. As we saw earlier, the three principal aspects: renunciation, bodhicitta, correct view of emptiness, right view, as well as tantric practice. One can bring one's tantric practice to bear in terms of all the activities one is doing. These bodhicitta mindfulness practices that he introduced at that retreat, and that I want to share with all of you in a very brief way today, make our lives highly meaningful because they keep our minds in bodhicitta. Many of them relate to the daily activities we engage in all the time. As Rinpoche said in Door to Satisfaction, the indifferent activities, the neutral activities. We are doing so many things throughout a good portion of our day that are kind of neutral. We're not killing beings, and we're not, reciting Dharma texts and prayers and whatever. We're not, meditating on compassion or bodhicitta, but we're going about our daily lives. Well, how can we make that portion of our lives much more meaningful? So by doing these everyday actions, Rinpoche says, with the motivation of bodhicitta, dedicating them for the happiness of all sentient beings, they all become the purest Dharma and the cause of enlightenment. This brings the greatest benefit to us, those around us, the world, and all sentient beings. So again, this is the whole idea that our motivation brings to bear in whatever actions we're doing that flavor. So if we have very positive motivation, the greatest motivation of bodhicitta that is so far-reaching and so powerful, well, then we make our actions into incredibly powerful actions, even if they're mundane. So in introducing these mindfulness practices actually come from the Sutra of the Clouds of the Sublime Rare Ones, the Sutra of the Buddha in the Mahayana Sanskrit tradition. Rinpoche as well. And Rinpoche has added some of these that are more contemporary, from his gurus and some from other sources. So I'm going to share the text with you really briefly. You can download it from FPMT's shop. It's all by donation, I believe. This is what it's called, Cultivating Mindfulness of Bodhicitta in Daily Activities, or essentially Bodhicitta Mindfulness. I think that's actually the name of the file up here in the corner. Bodhicitta Mindfulness. If you went to the shop, you would find it really easily. You can also, of course, just go to Lama Yeshe Wisdom Archives, and many of these practices are in that book, Bodhisattva Attitude, that you can find on Lama Yeshe Wisdom Archives as a PDF that you can look at from there. So again, these are where these come from. I'm going to scroll down a bit to get to a few of these actual practices. Again, and start with just one or two of these. You don't have to do all of them. There are a ton of these in this little booklet. When you lie down, and of course they encourage you when you lie down to go to bed at night to lie down in what's called the sleeping lion or snow lion position, where you're lying on your right side with your hand up by your head. Your feet are somewhat drawn up, a little bit of like a fetal position, but not completely. And then you leave your left hand resting on your left leg. And this position is said to be the position the Buddha passed away in. So it's a very favorable position to go into sleep. Anyway, when you lie down, think, I am bringing all sentient beings to the sorrowless state, to the state of non-abiding nirvana, the state of Buddhahood. When you go to sleep, think, as you're going to sleep, think, may all sentient beings achieve the Dharmakaya, which is the wisdom mind of a Buddha. When you wake up, think, may all sentient beings achieve the holy body of a Buddha. So whether you're sleeping or waking up from sleep, you want similar thoughts of like trying to infuse those moments that we normally, maybe we're even a little disgruntled when we're getting up in the morning, oh, we got to get up and deal with things or whatever. We'll try to infuse some positive thoughts into that. Let me go forward to a few of the other ones that are here. Dressing and putting on and releasing a belt. When you get dressed, think, may all sentient beings be clothed in shyness and shame, meaning may they have the positive forces to keep them from engaging in non-virtue. Doesn't have to do with shyness the normal way that we talk about it. Then let's see, putting on ornaments, washing and cleaning. When you do laundry, wash dishes, and so forth, meditate that the water is the complete graduated path to enlightenment, or all of the Dharma, and think, I am washing away all the stains of delusions of all sentient beings. So how many times a day do we wash our face or wash dishes or wash, clothes, whatever? We can make those into virtuous actions. When you clean a floor, when you dust and so forth, think, may all sentient beings not have bad conduct and have perfect pure conduct, kind of removing their bad behavior and so on. Anyway, I'm going to fast forward to the one that has to do with going to the toilet, because I find this isn't one of the easiest ones to practice for me, perhaps. I don't know why. But when you go to the toilet, visualize Vajrasattva on your crown and all sentient beings on a moon disk at your heart. You can even recite the mantra as many times as you can while you're on the toilet, and imagine nectar and beams descending down. Think that all the negative karmas, obscurations, sicknesses, and spirit harms of yourself and all sentient beings leave through your lower orifices in the form of urine or feces. It descends, enters the gaping mouth of the Lord of Death, who is 9 stories below the earth, and transforms into nectar, fully satisfying him. As you flush and close the lid of the toilet, imagine his mouth closes and is sealed with a very heavy golden double vajra, so he doesn't come to bear, the Lord of Death stays away. Anyway, there's some very cute ones in here, but there's also some that are just, again, very easy to practice. If you just take one of them, something that you do frequently, opening a door, closing a door, whatever the case might be, that's also a very powerful way to infuse those neutral activities with bodhicitta. I mean, it sounds a little crazy, like in some ways we go, how is that possible that you can transform these? But everything comes from the mind again. What are you doing with your mind? If you're going about those activities, eating food, taking a bath, washing your dishes, and you're doing nothing, or maybe even having deluded states of mind, all you're thinking about is objects of attachment, or thinking about the food, how delicious and wonderful it is, or whatever, well, then you're wasting an opportunity and you're creating negative karma, potentially. Whereas if you have bodhicitta motivation for all these things and bring that to bear, you can totally transform them. And I think this is how we actually get enlightened, is by being able to do this. I'll share the one little story that many of you have heard. It was at one of the retreats with Venerable Rabina that we had at the IHM retreat facility here in Santa Fe. And it was on a Sunday, and we were talking about the 6 perfections. And in particular, I think I even shared this in the last course on the one about joyous effort. One of the forces that is good to help keep your enthusiasm for your practice, it said, is to relinquish the activities when you need to take a rest. We all know how important it is to feel refreshed and revitalized before we go about doing more activity. And it's the same for Dharma. So anyway, at this retreat, I asked Venerable Rabina about this whole thing of, if you set kind of activities aside, it's really good, but it's a bit of a slippery slope. And I said, for example, our retreat is going to be ending and I want to go home. And at that time, Downton Abbey was on Sunday nights on Masterpiece Theater. And I would love to go home and just watch Downton Abbey and just chill out, because it was a good weekend, but intense weekend. And Venerable Rabina says, well, if you're going to watch Downton Abbey, you're going to watch it with bodhicitta, or you're not going to watch it at all. And that's kind of how we have to look at our lives. It's like, if we're going to do anything that even is entertainment, that even is like something that might seem a bit more frivolous, we'll do it with bodhicitta motivation. And she really emphasized that, and Rinpoche does, of course, as well. How do we transform these activities into something virtuous? By having bodhicitta motivation. And as he was saying earlier, start with the neutral activities. It's very hard, I think, to get to a place where we can transform non-virtue into virtue. But nonetheless, still generate bodhicitta motivation, even if your mind's gonna go out of control and crazy and what have you. Be sure to have some motivation to bear that becomes your causal motivation, that can have some influence on what you're doing. That's the gist of everything that I'm sharing in regard to that first topic. So that's pretty much it for that. Let's go on to the next topic I want to talk about based on the next chapter of Rinpoche's book, which is called Subduing the Mind. And we have this wonderful verse. Last time when I was teaching, I got to talk about that verse that has to do, that's from the Vajracutter Sutra, about a star, a visual aberration, and so on, that we do at the beginning of each of our classes. Today, due to Rinpoche's kindness of having this in his book, The Door to Satisfaction, we're going to look at this verse that we also recite every Sunday. Do not commit any non-virtuous actions. Perform only perfect virtuous actions. Subdue your mind thoroughly. This is the teaching of the Buddha. So in a sense, we have looked to some degree at the first two. How do we get away from non-virtue? Well, by, to some degree, seeing the faults of the non-virtuous states of mind, desire, anger, what have you. Try to not engage in actions that are influenced by those non-virtues. To perform perfect virtuous actions, of course, means having positive intentions behind what we're doing, and of course, letting the actions of body and speech follow from that. But this whole idea of this third line, subdue your mind thoroughly, excuse me, that's the deeper work that we always have to do, that will influence the actions of body and speech that we're doing, that will make sure that we are using this life to create the causes for ultimate satisfaction for ourselves and all beings. So let's take a look at what Rinpoche says on this verse. Excuse me just a moment. Allergies, I think. The very essence of this verse is not to commit any non-virtuous actions. Thinking that the source of life, suffering, and problems is external is itself the problem. Separating your own mind from the origin of problems and blaming external sources, such as other people or objects, only brings more problems. Of course, this is the initial understanding that is so crucial to practicing Buddhism, is to recognize that it's not the external that is the problem, it's the internal that is the problem. And that we have to work from the inside to deal with whatever's going on the outside, not try to fix the outside or blame the outside for the problems that we're having in our own minds. Thinking in this way, and also thinking that happiness comes from outside, we do nothing with our own mind. This mind that has been unsubdued for beginningless rebirths is left alone, still unsubdued. We haven't subdued our mind yet, at least I haven't. And so if we haven't done that work yet, are we going to do that in this life? Or are we going to go on to our next rebirth and still have our mind unsubdued? Nothing is developed. Nothing has changed, he says. Constantly we create the cause of suffering in future lives and create problems even now in this life. And this is the price we pay for not subduing our minds, for not actually doing the deeper work to address the patterns of behavior that are perpetuating our stay in samsara and that are also keeping us from being enlightened and being a benefit to others. It is good to relate this verse to our past problems, and it is especially effective to relate the line, subdue your own mind, to our pride, anger, jealousy, desire, and our thick ignorance. Subduing these delusions is the teaching of the Buddha. And this is really the crux of everything the Buddha taught, was to help us to transform our minds, to remove all those tendencies that are negative, that are the source of suffering, and to supplant them with those that are positive, which are the source of happiness and joy. And we all have that fundamental desire to be happy, to not suffer. It's just we haven't really learned how the Buddha addresses this. How does the Buddha, really help us to accomplish that goal? Most beings in the world, unless they have access to these teachings, don't know how to achieve happiness and avoid suffering. Not subduing these states of mind is not the teaching of the Buddha. In other words, not doing anything about our delusions, but keeping busy doing many other so-called spiritual practices is not the teaching of the Buddha. So we're seeing a repetition of some of the themes we've seen earlier in the book in terms of making sure that we don't just engage in these so-called spiritual practices, reciting texts, doing all sorts of things to, fill our day with what are looking like virtuous practices, but we're not subduing our mind in the least. If we're doing all of these activities out of worldly concern or simply thinking that will look good in terms of all the ways that we're trying to practice the Dharma in a so-called way, but we're not really practicing Dharma, well, then there's not much benefit. If we're putting on a show of all these various activities, but nothing is going on inside, no change is happening inside, well, then that's a big problem. I'll share here once more something I share from Venerable Rabina constantly. And I asked her recently, where she got this quote from, and I can't remember what she said. But she when she gives it, she says it's from someone else, but it's so her that I can't believe there is anyone else involved. But she says being a good Buddhist doesn't mean that you're sort of sitting there all peaceful, and everything is going smoothly and wonderfully, and you're just in this glowing, state of transcendence or something. She says being a good Buddhist means having your hands in your own shit. And that's really what it's all about. It's like, if we're doing the work on the make it look like we're great spiritual practitioners on the outside, but inside we're just still mired in our own shit. Well, we have to get in there and do that work. We have to get in there and actually change our minds. And this is the hardest job we'll ever love. Isn't that what there was some commercial like that? It was for like the Marines or something. The hardest job you'll ever love. Well, this is the hardest job you'll ever love. This is the hardest work that we ever are going to do. And the good thing is once you do it, then you don't have to do it again. I mean, that's the good news about the Buddha's teachings, right? If we go to the degree of completely subduing our minds, well, then you never have to go through it again. Whereas so many other things we do in our lives, other jobs we have, we might enjoy them or might find them challenging or whatever, but we have to keep doing them over and over again. You get to the end point of this, and that's it. You never have to do the work again. So this is hard work, without a doubt. I mean, I can testify. Definitely, I will give testimony to that. This is, very difficult stuff. And I can't say I've done that good of a job of it. Looking at what Rinpoche is teaching in this book and recognizing that, yes, I mean, to what degree have I practiced Dharma over the last 30 years or so? I think we all have to be examining that constantly and saying, am I really doing the work that needs to be done? And this whole task of subduing our minds, which we recite every Sunday when we recite that verse, subdue your mind thoroughly. We have to understand what that means. We have to understand the importance of that. Otherwise, as Rinpoche says, we're only going to create the causes for more suffering. We're only going to, pretend to be doing other things and what have you, but it's not real spiritual practice. Real spiritual practice is getting in there and digging into the garbage in your own mind, coming to know your own mind and address what you see. So Rinpoche then goes on to talk about the delusions. Delusions make the mind unhappy, unpeaceful, unsubdued. Even though our actions may look like Dharma and be called Dharma or spiritual practice, they are not the teaching of the Buddha unless they destroy delusions. If we only get more prideful through our practice, we only have more attachment, we only have, other crazed states, well, then what is it? It's not Dharma. Once more, Dharma, technically it's defined as that which holds you back from suffering. Well, what causes suffering? Our deluded states of mind, beginning with our fundamental ignorance that we'll talk about next week that we can address through the wisdom of emptiness, but manifesting in the form of these other afflictive states of anger, attachment, again, jealousy, pride, belligerence, spite, all these, destructive states of mind that we have in our world that only cause us and others pain. Another definition, I guess he could say, of Dharma, because he gave one earlier in terms of Dharma being, anything which is dedicated for the happiness beyond this life, for future happiness, whether it be, future lives or liberation and enlightenment. But here, the definition he gives is any remedy for the delusions. If an action that is done in the name of Christianity or some other religion is a remedy for the delusions, if it subdues your anger, attachment, ignorance, selfishness, then it's Dharma. I like that he said this. It's so funny because, I hadn't read this book completely in many, many years. But I often put that forward that, the teachings of other traditions can be considered Dharma if they are doing the work of Dharma. Because when we look at someone like Jesus Christ or any other great prophets, spiritual leaders of our age, our times, we can see that if the work that they're doing is in line with this, well then why wouldn't we consider it in the same vein and not, again, put down or despise any of these other spiritual traditions if the work that practitioners of those traditions are doing helps them to subdue their minds and subdue the crazy behavior that results from it, well then it's Dharma. Anything that is not a remedy for delusion is not Dharma. Okay, so in order to bring happiness to yourself and others, Dharma has to be the remedy for the delusions. If Dharma helps the delusions, as I was saying earlier, it just makes you more prideful, for example, then no matter how much we practice, we will not see any improvement in the minds. In fact, it will become worse and worse, more and more. I shouldn't say subdued. I don't know what maybe I meant. I have to check that, page 70. Let me check it right now. I've got the book right here. Um, mm, Unsubdued. Sorry, I missed the un. Okay, so I will check. I will correct all of these things in the final edit of these that will go out to the Dropbox. More and more unsubdued, harder and harder. This actually happens. They do say that many people who engage in the Dharma, although that's like engaging in the Dharma in quotes, they don't really do that deeper change. And so they end up becoming quite insensitive to the Dharma. This is something to be on the lookout for. That's why it's so important that we have some regular practice where we look at these teachings and try to integrate them into our minds. And when we're hearing these words every Sunday, that they just don't become kind of a spiritual entertainment. They're actually spiritual advice, spiritual instruction, from Rinpoche and from other teachers that we can then bring to bear in our own minds. If we don't do that work, if we aren't constantly recycling the teachings we get into our own minds and integrating them into our being, well, then it's going to become they even use the example of like these leather, they use the leather of the yak to actually hold the yak butter. And so they make like a pouch or a sack out of this leather. And of course, it keeps the butter from the yak butter and what have you very soft inside, but it makes the outside really hard. So it's impenetrable. Normally they would use the yak butter to get it into the leather and make the leather quite soft and pliable. But they can also use the leather to make this hard shell that all of the butter is kept in. And if you think about our minds that way, if we have these sort of hard exterior minds that nothing gets in, but we hold a lot of the soft stuff, the Dharma, but we never really integrate it. Instead, we're just kind of a container for it. Whereas our work is to take the butter of the Dharma and to keep pushing it into the leather, working it into the leather of our minds, keeping our minds very soft and pliable and receptive, and using these teachings to change our minds. It's a wonderful analogy in my mind to how we have to work with the Dharma to make sure that it doesn't become just, again, facts and things that we can say to others and things that we can say, oh yeah, I did that course and I know that information, but then have you integrated it? Have you realized it to some degree? So this is the challenge that we face with regard to this. That's what it means to, again, subdue our minds, to work with our minds. Rinpoche says, even though you may always be hearing Dharma, speaking Dharma, reading Dharma, or living in a Dharma center, even though your whole life revolves around Dharma, and as many people's lives do, if your delusions increase, then your spiritual practice is helping your delusions instead of harming them. It's like, your delusion's best friend, because you're not doing anything that is meaningful with the Dharma that you're receiving. That's why it is challenging. And I know in this day and age, we have so many teachings going on. People might think, well, how can I possibly integrate all these teachings? Well, make a decision on the basis of your own assessment of your life right now, what it is you need to work on, what particular delusion is problematic for you, and begin to apply the teachings to that. If your pride, anger, desire, and so forth increase, your Dharma education is creating negative karma instead of purifying what you have already created. In order for you to receive happiness from Dharma, your practice has to harm the delusions. This is the big gist of this entire message, is that we have to do what we can to bring the Dharma to bear as a counterforce to all of these deluded states of mind that are the problem. And since everything is dependent on our own mind, as we see as a common thread throughout all of our Buddhist teachings, we have to subdue our own mind. We have to give up wrong thoughts, which are the cause of suffering and which bring problems to ourselves and to numberless others, now and in life after life. If these wrong thoughts are eliminated, only happiness. There's no cause of problems, no creator of problems, because that's where our problems come from, is from our own deluded states of mind. The more we eliminate these, the more and more happiness there is. I put in a lot of slides. Let me go forward to this one. By tying your mind to bodhicitta, you tie up all those numberless dangerous animals and enemies, all the various things that we have on the outside. How do we tame them? By taming the mind, especially taming the mind by having these positive states of mind. Taming this one thing, your mind, also tames all others. And if we do this, again, there will be outside, if we don't do this, there'll be outside harm, but if we do it, there will be no harm from outside. The outside enemy, Rinpoche says in the end, there exists only if there is anger inside. There is that little phrase, I think it's from Rinpoche, where it essentially says, no anger inside, no enemy outside. Who creates an enemy? Only your mind creates the enemy. In the moment, even when you're experiencing something from somebody, you're creating them as an enemy, because you could choose to see them as actually a dear friend who's helping you to have that karma ripen, helping you to practice deeper compassion. It all depends on how you're looking at things. But moreover, how do you create those types of difficult people in your lives? Through your own negative state of mind in the past. That's what causes us to have those unpleasant experiences. But again, even in the moment, they can be transformed. Everything can be transformed. So let me go back to just wrapping up this. There's, I think, just a little bit more in terms of what there's one little quote. I think this may actually be the last quote from Lodro Gyaltsen's text in the book. He didn't have any more quotes. Rinpoche didn't have any more quotes in it. What is the use of any conduct apart from the conduct of protecting the mind? It's a nice little quote. Maybe this would be like a nice little fortune in a fortune cookie. If you got that, then maybe if everyone got that, maybe they would do deeper work on their minds. But there's no other use to any other conduct apart from protecting our minds, from making sure our minds don't go to the negative places and are in the more positive vein. So this is very good to remember, Rinpoche says, in your day-to-day life. If you forget to protect your own mind, what is the use of any traditional form of discipline? All these sort of things that are a part of Buddhist practice but don't really do that work. We have to do that deeper work. If the mind is not protected, he says, you cannot stop your suffering and problems, without a doubt. Even though you may do hundreds of other things, if you leave out this most important practice, you cannot stop your problems and achieve happiness, especially ultimate happiness. This is good to remember. Okay, let's stop there. And I'll come back to the slides and we'll go into the last topic. I'm not even sure I need to present a lot of. Rinpoche has some wonderful advice on death and impermanence that I'll get to in a moment. But let's talk a little bit about, before we go on to that though, about what does it mean then? How do we do this work? The first thing, of course, is to bring to bear thoughts that are counterforces to the delusions. As I said, if you decide through your own investigation that there's one place you'd like to start, and for some people they might think, well, maybe I'll start with a lesser delusion because then might be a little bit easier for me to tackle. But nonetheless, a lot of the Lojong teachings, remember this is in the vein of Lojong or mind training, give the advice to start with the most difficult one first. And there is some benefit to that. If you find that you're somebody who has a lot of anger, a lot of jealousy, a lot of pride, a lot of attachment, well, then starting with that one is going to make a profound impact on your life. Why? Because that is your default delusion to a large degree, and you will lessen the amount of negative karma you're creating when you tackle that one. Admittedly, it's going to be more difficult because that one is more deeply ingrained. It's got a deeper groove in our minds, if you will. And the whole purpose of our Buddhist practice is to fill the groove, make it narrower and narrower so that eventually we don't fall into that groove all the time. So admittedly, it's harder work, but it will be a huge boon to your practice if you're able to overcome that one first. Secondly, it also will help us to have more confidence in doing the other work that is entailed in our Buddhist practice. If you defeat the larger enemy in your mind, then you'll have really great confidence against all the smaller ones, right? You'll be able to squash them really easily because you know that you can do the work. So say it is something like anger. Well, again, there are many techniques for working with combating anger. Venerable Tipton Chodron's book on working with anger goes through the whole extent of them. But essentially what I kind of classify things into a couple of categories. The initial thing that may be enough for some levels of delusions, but for those that are very powerful, it probably isn't enough, is to simply see their disadvantages. We already did that with regard to desire earlier in this course, right? Last week, we looked at all the faults, the shortcomings of desire and following the mind of desire. Well, it's the same with regard to anger. You can look at all the amazing disadvantages, all the confounding disadvantages of anger. Anger leads to great conflict with others. It causes ourselves to feel poorly. I mean, do you feel good when you're angry and red-faced. No, all of these things, plus the karmic consequences of following the mind of anger. For some people, again, with some delusions, seeing the disadvantages is enough. It's like I was saying earlier, when a doctor tells you, oh, you're going to have health problems in the future if you don't correct your diet right now. Well, that may be enough for some people. They go, oh, there's disadvantages to what I'm doing currently. Well, then I'll do something different. That may be enough. But that may not be enough for many of you. You might need what are called temporal antidotes. Temporal antidotes are what the Buddha defined as those things that will be a counterforce to what you are currently experiencing in terms of that delusion. So let's look at anger, and specifically if we look at anger in relation to people, if we are angry and upset at certain people in our lives, well, how do we combat that? Of course, the antidote to anger is often defined as patience, but just being told to be patient usually isn't enough, right? When we were kids, that was the case, right? When we got angry or upset because they didn't have our toy at the store or whatever, and we had a little temper tantrum and, or whatever. If we were told by our parents to just be patient, well, if they don't give you any instructions, what does that look like? How do you get there? And as adults, we still need instructions. We still need to know how to be patient, how to cultivate a mind that's not going to be disturbed when we don't get what we want, when we have to face what is difficult. So how do we cultivate patience? Again, there are a variety of ways. I'm just going to point out the more traditional ones. First, with regard to a person, we can begin to see them in a different lens. Understand that that person who is annoying to you, who is harming you, is doing that only out of the force of their own delusions. Therefore, we can first of all understand that they're not fully in control. Even if they're a practicing Buddhist and you think, oh, well, they should be in control. They've been practicing Buddhism. They shouldn't get angry. They shouldn't get upset. Well, they still are a being who is under the control of delusions. Regardless of what their level of practice is, they still have that manifesting, no doubt, until they've done that deeper work. And in that light, they are an object of compassion and love for us. Just as we can have some level of compassion for ourselves because we see how crazy our own minds are, we should have compassion for others because we see that they're equally crazy. They're doing things out of the force of their own ignorance and delusions, and perhaps they don't even have the Buddhist tools that we have to work on their minds. So therefore, they're nothing but an object of compassion. So in the moment when you are normally going to have anger arising, that would be in response to that person who's harming you. If we instead have love and compassion arising, it completely blocks anger. Now, of course, the tricky part of this is you have to have familiarity with anger and love towards that person. You can't just conjure it up immediately, right? Because in the moment when you're being harmed, it's nowhere near, it's not something that's that evident in your own mind unless you've trained with it. If you've trained in developing compassion and loving kindness towards difficult people, then when a difficult person comes into your life, you'll be able to bring that mind to bear. And it's an immediate block to anger. It supplants anger with a more positive state of mind. So the first technique, again, of seeing the disadvantages of anger is where we're just sort of being more analytical about what's going on here, and that may be enough. The second technique is a more powerful force because it actually gets at something that is wholesome that will supplant and get in the way of that delusion arising. It does two things. It blocks the delusion from coming up so that that lessens, but it also heightens the positive states of mind, right? Because you're generating greater compassion and love every time you meet somebody who is normally considered to be an enemy, somebody who would trigger your anger. So it's a very powerful way to work with your anger. And any of the other delusions is to cultivate a deeper awareness of things, deeper qualities that we want to cultivate on our path. So that's an important part of our practice as well, is to use those temporal antidotes. I'm not going to go into all of them as part of this course. Know that they're taught generally in the Lam Rim, in the middle scope, as ways of combating the delusions. In fact, there's wonderful commentary towards the end of volume 2 of uh, Geshe Sopa's Steps on the Path to Enlightenment. That's his commentary on the Lam Rim Chenmo Tsongkhapa's immense Stages of the Path text. And we just know that that has some good advice about working with the key delusions, our attachment and so on, and kind of the minds we need to bring to bear that are, once more, seeing things more accurately, which increases our wisdom, or cultivating positive qualities, which increase those qualities, like love and compassion, and as the antidote to anger that I just mentioned. The third technique, of course, is what we're going to go into next week, which is the ultimate antidote, which is the wisdom realizing emptiness. Now you might think, well, why don't I just go to that one? That one sounds like, if it's the ultimate antidote, the final antidote, well, then I should just practice that. Well, it's probably going to be hard unless, once more, you have a really good understanding of emptiness. You have that wisdom that you can bring to bear that will undo the whole thing. Why is anger arising? Because you're strongly grasping at the I, because you're strongly grasping at that person who's harming you as inherently existent. You're strongly grasping at the hurt that you're experiencing on the basis of their actions, their words, what have you. All of that grasping is what's under the surface that is causing the problem and the resultant karma and what have you that we're generating in those moments of anger. So that is the ultimate antidote. But unless you're familiar with emptiness, just like if you're not familiar with compassion, you can't bring it to bear against anger, well, then emptiness is going to be out of reach. It's not going to be something that you can actually cultivate at that time, some awareness of that will help you. So once more, that's why it's taught as the more ultimate antidote. It gets rid of all the delusions. It's not temporal in the sense that compassion does lessen our anger, but it doesn't do anything to our desire, right? If I have more compassion, how does that help, decrease my desire? It's not a direct antidote to that at all. But the wisdom realizing emptiness is the ultimate antidote and the across the board antidote, because if you have that and bring that to bear, then you can undo all of the delusions. That's your final solution to all of this. Again, and there are many other little iterations of this, but those are the three main things that I like to emphasize is, once more, seeing the disadvantages, the shortcomings of that delusion, whatever it is that you're working on, and that may begin to lessen a little bit, or at least make you more aware of the fact that you need to address it. Because if you see that this is problematic for you and it's only going to lead to future suffering, well, then I do need to do something about that. Then bring to bear the temporal antidotes that act in the moment. Through the force of meditating on these, strengthening them, you can block those delusions from arising. But you can never get rid of them in a deeper way until you generate the ultimate antidote, which we can do at a conceptual level initially, but we will eventually have to do it at a much deeper level in order to overcome all of these once and for all. But this is the process of subduing our minds. We have to become more aware of what's going on, what they're doing, how we actually create things that will be counterforces to them. They don't go away on their own. If our delusions went away on their own, they'd be gone by now, right? Instead, we keep them in our mind and feed them even. So this is not such a good thing. It keeps us in this state of suffering and keeps us unable to help others. So any questions from today? No? Okay. I didn't get around to talking about death and impermanence. And, that's okay in some ways. I'll introduce it really briefly next week, but I won't go into, maybe won't share quite as much the slides. But know that this is also, again, one of the main ways that we are triggered into wanting to do something more meaningful with this life, is by recognizing that this life has a limit and we don't know what the limit is. Every one of us lives every day thinking we have plenty of time, even if we're 90 some years old, plenty of time. Maybe at that point you do start to think you don't have quite so much time, but nonetheless, we have no guarantee that we even have another day, much less another minute, another hour, what have you. So we should be using the impetus of knowing that this life comes to an end as a boon to our practice, making sure that we use every day meaningfully. So maybe that's all I perhaps need to even say on that. I'll take a look at Rinpoche's teachings on that again and maybe share a little. In our final class next week, though, I want to go on to talk a bit more about how we really generate, based on Rinpoche's advice, the mind that cherishes others, that holds them very dear, that is the platform for bodhicitta, to strengthen that mind. And then also how we bring to bear this wisdom realizing emptiness. He has a chapter that's called seeing no I to cherish. Where is this I that we are so caught up in, that we are grasping to so tightly, and do a little bit of wisdom teachings. I did some in the last course when we got to the perfection of wisdom, so maybe I don't need to do quite as much, but kind of throwing everything in there. Rinpoche has the whole Lam Rim, I think, in this book somehow. So skinny little book, but it's just amazing how he brings all these teachings to bear. So I hope it's useful today, what we talked about. I would encourage you to maybe do this process if you have the time and the desire to explore it, of taking a look at your own mind, seeing what is going on, what's the main culprit, the main foe that you'd like to begin to address, and try to use some of these techniques that we've talked about, seeing the disadvantages as well as whatever temporal antidotes. And if you need help on some of this, some guidance on some of this, feel free to write to me, and I'm happy to provide some places where you can find more information about combating that particular delusion. So maybe what I'll do though in the meantime is I'll make sure that Mary has out there the antidotes to the delusions as they're taught in a meditation from Discovering Buddhism. I'll make sure that that gets to the Dropbox. It's actually, Mary's not even doing them anymore. I think someone else is doing them, but because Mary is, anyway, well, I'll make sure that it gets out there so that people can, access that material on the Dropbox. All right, no other questions or comments? Let's go ahead and do our prayers then, another important part of our practice together. And first, bring to mind all those beings that you're dedicating for. I might mention a very dear friend of mine who passed away last Sunday evening. So last Sunday when we were together, I knew that she was in the process of dying, but I didn't know that she had passed away until the next day, actually Monday. Her name is Irene Smith. And why I'm asking for prayers for her in particular is because she's so important to me. She was one of these people who taught me how to be compassionate in the world. And not that I'm a great example, but she was, and I'm really indebted to her. And so I'm asking again for people to do strong prayers for her, but we also can think about everyone that we're holding in our hearts. Each one of us have people who are dear to us, who are experiencing obstacles, who are ill, who are dying, or who have died. Bring them to mind in particular as we recite these verses, thinking that they will especially receive the benefit of what we've done here today. Help create the causes for them to have happiness, to be free from suffering, and so on. But as we recite these verses, also think about all sentient beings and how we want these benefits to accrue for each and every one of them. May all beings everywhere plagued by sufferings of body and mind obtain an ocean of happiness and joy by virtue of my merits. May no living creature suffer, commit evil, or ever fall ill. May no one be afraid or belittled with a mind weighed down by depression. May the blind see forms and the deaf hear sounds. May those whose bodies are worn with toil be restored on finding repose. May the naked find clothing, the hungry find food. May the thirsty find water and delicious drinks. May the poor find wealth, those weak with sorrow find joy. May the forlorn find hope, constant happiness, and prosperity. May there be timely rains and bountiful harvests. May all medicines be effective and wholesome prayers bear fruit. May all who are sick and ill quickly be freed from their ailments. Whatever diseases there are in the world, may they never occur again. May the frightened cease to be afraid, and those bound be freed. May the powerless find power, and may people think of benefiting each other. For as long as space remains, for as long as sentient beings remain, until then may I too remain to dispel the miseries of the world. And we make strong prayers for the good health and long lives of our gurus as we recite these prayers for His Holiness Lama Zopa Rinpoche, as well as Tenzin El Sahita, Lama Yeshe's reincarnation. Extend this out to all spiritual guides. As Rinpoche said earlier, whoever they are, if they're in whatever tradition, Christianity, Hinduism, Islam, Judaism, wherever, if they're teaching Dharma, that which protects others from suffering, may they have good health and long lives. And may others always benefit from the presence of these spiritual guides in every lifetime. The wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. You who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers honoring the three jewels, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. Venerable One, to you whose kindness exceeds that of all the conquerors for those wanderers in far-off places, especially the West, mindful of your loving concern for us in intentionally descending again into a family of a far distant land, we make this request. O Lama, please, please live long. Okay, thank you all so much. Again, take care, be safe, healthy, and I will see you all again very soon. And do your best to work with these teachings. I know, again, there are a lot of teachings out there, a lot of things that you're receiving in terms of Dharma, but it is so important that we take some of these teachings and always try to integrate them into our minds. Otherwise, it's the analogy they use in Tibetan. They have the chang, which is the barley beer that they have. They put some of the barley grain on the top and it just floats there, kind of like the foam on a beer here or something. It just kind of stays on the top. It never sinks in. So we want to sink it in. It's a weird example, but that's the one that Tibetans always use. I guess it's something they know well. So anyway, so please try to bring this Dharma into your minds to subdue your own mind. And we'll meet for the final class in this series next Sunday. All right, be well.